Donald Trump addressed the Israeli Knesset. His speech came after all the remaining Israeli hostages returned back to Israel, Hamas releasing the last 20 living hostages as Trump's ceasefire plan takes hold. The remains of 4 Israelis will also be released this Monday. Now, in exchange, Israel has started releasing the first batch of nearly 2,000 Palestinians, the majority of whom have been detained without charge during the course of the war. Trump praised Israel's Prime Minister, but said Benjamin Netanyahu isn't the easiest person to deal with. He called the truce deal an incredible triumph for Israel and the world. Trump hailing the historic dawn of a new Middle East, even suggesting the possibility of a peace deal between Israel and Iran. Now, before the U.S. president spoke, the Speaker of the Knesset, the leader of the opposition, and Israel's Prime Minister all heaped their praise on the U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, we will be joined by France 24's correspondent Noga Tarnopolsky on the ground in Tel Aviv's Hosted Square. But joining me on set is our foreign affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Doug, there was a whole lot we listened to over the span of that 2 hours and 15 minutes from the Israeli side and from the U.S. President Donald Trump. Let's start with the nature of this deal. Yeah. Donald Trump essentially saying this is a historic moment that Israel should use to seize on peace and potential new avenues for expanding those Abraham Accords, which he sort of spearheaded.
Yeah, Delano, I mean, I'll cut to the chase. You're right in the sense that this was a speech writ in superlatives. And what I mean is wishful thinking superlatives. He said the age of terror has ended. He said that this is the historic dawn of a new Middle East. Now, it would be hard to argue that a lot of people, obviously, who would not want that, to see that. But it's hard. You have to keep the perspective. This speech is taking place on the very first day, the very first phase, a very welcome first phase, a phase that has brought joy and relief, as he rightly said, across the Middle East. We can't be mistaken about that. However, very much the first phase. Donald Trump's wishful thinking statements sort of set this up as a fait accompli. It's a done deal. Peace has arrived. The war is over. If you wish it, it will happen. Now, perhaps there's an element in there that by sheer force of personality and force of, as he sees it, his negotiating skills, his world-beating deal-making skills, by simply saying the words, he can will that into reality. He can make it happen. But I think the biggest thing you need to remember in the context of this speech is, as we stand here today, this is a first extremely welcome phase of what is a 20-point plan under Donald Trump's proposed peace plan, a phase that is basically a ceasefire and hostage in exchange for Palestinian prisoner swap deal. That very first phase. We don't have to go over what is left unsaid and the enormous and daunting obstacles that lie ahead, not least of which are obviously the Hamas disarmament, the Israeli withdrawal, and the future governance of Gaza. And what role will the Palestinians play in that, or the Palestinian Authority, which is presumably has to be reformed before it can play any role. So governance, reconstruction, Israeli troop withdrawal, Hamas disarmament, the role of Hamas in the future of Gaza, the peace plan obviously excluding any role whatsoever. There are so many unknown unknowns, as you might call it, in this deal that it's not just keeping things in perspective. It really is saying we have to take this on this day, credit where credit is due. This is quite an amazing feat, getting the hostages out of there, getting the first Palestinian prisoners released as well. But I will say that Donald Trump in this forum today was really, this is if you were trying to script a scenario of the type of audience and the type of forum in which Donald Trump likes to speak, this is it. It was a forum in which his captive, his rapt audience, if this is even possible, was heaping more praise on Donald Trump than he heaps on himself normally. He was called, the greatest friend of Israel ever. He was called a colossus. He was called, a man who 2,000 years from now will be known as the greatest friend that the Jewish state ever had. At the same time, he really used this speech to go off script a lot, to veer off script in a very momentous moment, a historic moment, a moment that you can't take away from him, but went off script once again to do what has become a signature trademark with Donald Trump in other contexts as well, denigrating and tearing into his rivals, his perceived rivals, in this case, tearing into Barack Obama for signing the Iran nuclear deal in the first place. And let's remind ourselves, they signed, at the time that deal was signed, the U.S. signed that deal, Iran was judged by the international community and the United Nations to be complying with the deal. Tearing into Joe Biden, who at one point had also been called a great friend of Israel and was the only president who really was a self-declared, a self-professed Zionist, who nurtured a nearly half-century staunchly supportive relationship with Israel to the point that it brought him to sorrow within his own Democratic Party, who thought he was too friendly with Israel. All of that is cast aside. Today it's Donald Trump putting himself on a pedestal, but more than that, the people in his audience, those on the receiving end of his words, putting him on that pedestal and raising him even higher on it. Every Israeli official who stepped up to that to speak at that podium mentioned the fact that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize.
And
the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, going so far as to say that the Nobel Prize Committee in Oslo not choosing him was a grave mistake, and saying you will get it next year.
I know. I was going to mention that fact. It was quite interesting that all three of them, even Netanyahu, spoke about the Nobel Prize. I'm going to get the domestic reaction to the speech from our correspondent, Noga, in just a second. But I want to talk about the second part of today, because we're going to have, there was some confusion earlier whether Benjamin Netanyahu would be attending the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh for Gaza's future. First, his office said he was attending. Then we were told he's not attending.
The Egyptians had said he was attending as well.
Because of the Jewish holiday, he will not be attending, because this, of course, is very important. In the run-up to this meeting today, so many questions about how is Hamas going to disarm, who is going to govern Gaza, and a lot of the people who are going to be at that meeting in Egypt today, including the French president and Spain's prime minister, for instance. Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't had the best things to say about these people after they recognize the Palestinian state.
Giant questions, especially, from the European perspective. The Europeans have been trying to get sort of a say-in, a voice in on this. And ever since Emmanuel Macron sort of spearheaded the drive for international recognition of a two-state solution, an idea which was, lambasted by both the Israelis and the Americans on prominent display today. The Europeans have been, I would say, marginalized in this process, and their role has been reduced to fighting for the scraps of trying to get a place at that table. They are very much, if the European role is to be looked at, what role could they play, right? Because they have had very estranged relations with Israel, especially in France. The relationship has fallen to lows, notably over Emmanuel Macron's decision to recognize Palestinian statehood, leading others to do so in Europe and outside Europe as well. Because of that, Europe has been left really in a weak position when it comes to trying to inveigh upon the Donald Trump administration to have that voice. Well, you have, in a sense, at this summit, in the makings, broad lines, a sort of demarcation line between, on the one hand, you have the U.S. and the Israelis, as we saw, marching in lockstep, and that was on full display in Donald Trump's speech just a few minutes ago. And on the other side, the Europeans and a lot of the rest of the international community looking on and trying to think practically, what role can we play in trying to ensure real peace and stability, and trying to ensure that there is somehow a role also for the Palestinians in this process, in their own future, trying to ensure that there is a real role in the governance, finding some sort of mechanism for a fair governance that would presumably include elections at some point, and also the humanitarian issues, which is a euphemism. Humanitarian issues means how to, if not undo the devastation, because tens of thousands, if not millions of Gazans living in that strip have been left deeply wounded and traumatized by this war. And trying to reach a point, a state where there will be an ability to bring, to reinvigorate that society, that wounded, scarred, devastated society, and to bring them back into sort of the full court of play in what Gaza's future is going to be. That is going to be a major outstanding issue hovering in the backdrop of this conference today. And like I said, the Europeans want to play a role in that, but I do suspect because the issues are so big and because the 20-point plan is so vague on so many of these issues, notably the future, the prospect of two states coexisting side by side. It says a pathway to some sort of Palestinian entity, but it doesn't say two-state solution, far from it. Because the Americans and the Israelis seem to be far apart from even the agenda of the regional countries, the neighbors that are going to be at this summit, whether it's Turkey and Qatar and Egypt and Indonesia and Jordan, UAE. All these countries also want to, and they know they need to, promote a role for the Palestinians and make sure that they are not written off of this process. And whatever happens next in the eventual reconstruction of Gaza. They're being asked to put up a lot of money. Donald Trump referred to the wealth of the players sitting at that meeting. He's transactional, and he admires people with money and people with wealth, and that was very clear in his speech. But the question is, they're not going to write a blank check. And are they just going to put up, a lot of wealth for the rebuilding and reconstruction of Gaza if they don't feel like, the Palestinians are also getting a foothold, a say in their own future here? This is a daunting summit. Today will be about the symbolism, but going forward, it's going to be about a lot more and overcoming obstacles which aren't simply on paper. They are obstacles that require addressing of the kind that we didn't hear a word of in today's address.